Get off my land." The words hit Belle Ford like a physical blow, stopping her mid-step on the porch of the Garrison Ranch house. She had walked 4 miles in the blistering August heat of 1882, through red dust and rattlesnake grass, with a letter of recommendation crumpled in her fist and a single carpetbag swinging from her aching shoulder. She had rehearsed her speech 100 times. She had prepared for dismissal, for skepticism, for a man who might laugh at a woman asking for ranch work. She had not prepared for this. Abraham Garrison stood in the doorway like he had been carved from the same red stone as the Colorado bluffs behind him. He was tall, broad through the chest, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples from the sweat of a working day. His jaw was set hard. His gray eyes were not unkind, but they were closed, the way a vault is closed, with something heavy and deliberate behind the lock. He was not looking at Belle the way a man looks at a stranger. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that has arrived too late, or perhaps too soon, or perhaps at the exact wrong moment to unmake him. "I am not leaving," Belle said. Her voice did not shake. She had promised herself that it would not shake. "I have a letter from Dr. Harlan in Pueblo. I worked his household for 2 years without complaint. I can cook, manage accounts, handle a horse, and I am not afraid of work, any work." "I know what you can do," Abraham said, and that was the strange part, the part that made the hair rise on Belle's arms despite the heat. He said it like he already knew, like he had been expecting her, like her arrival was not a surprise but a reckoning. "Eliza sent you," Belle blinked. "I beg your pardon, my sister, Eliza. She wrote to some woman in Pueblo about finding me help. I told her not to. I told her I did not need a woman coming out here to fix things." His voice dropped, and Belle heard it then, the hidden darkness underneath the closed vault, something that was not anger but had been living next to anger long enough to wear its face. "I especially do not need it now." Belle's hand tightened on the handle of her carpetbag. She had no idea who Eliza Garrison was. She had answered an advertisement, a simple hand-printed notice pinned to the board outside the post office in Pueblo, Colorado. Cook and housekeeper needed. Garrison Ranch, Caldera Flats. Inquire with seriousness only. She had inquired with more than seriousness. She had inquired with the last $3 she had in the world, because the only other option had been the kind of work that would have made her mother's ghost weep. "I did not come here because of your sister," Belle said carefully. "I came because I need the work, Mr. Garrison. I am asking you for nothing more and nothing less than honest employment." Abraham stared at her for a long moment. The late afternoon sun slanted hard across the porch boards between them. A horse stamped somewhere in the barn, the whole wide sky of Colorado pressed down hot and enormous. "Come inside," he finally said, "before you fall down in the heat." It was not welcome, it was not warmth. But it was a door opening, and Belle Ford had learned years ago that a door opening was enough. She had arrived in Colorado territory 9 months earlier, in the raw November of 1881, with a situation that most respectable society would have described in whispers. She had been employed as a schoolteacher in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where she had grown up the daughter of a mining company clerk named Douglas Ford, who had been a kind and gentle man until the mines took his lungs and his money in the same year, leaving Belle at 19 with a small education, a smaller inheritance, and a mother who had followed her father to the grave before the winter was out. Undone by grief and a cold, she could not fight without the will to fight it. Belle had taught school for 2 years after that, boarding with the Harlan family to save money, a quiet and careful life that had suited her natural temperament, which ran toward order and precision, and the deep private satisfaction of problems solved well. Then came the letter from her mother's brother, her Uncle Cyrus, who lived in Denver and who wrote with the booming confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything, telling Belle that the West was where opportunity lived, and that he could set her up with a position at his hotel, and that she should come immediately. She had come. She had arrived to find that Uncle Cyrus had died of a stroke 2 weeks before her train pulled in, that his hotel had been claimed by creditors, and that Denver in November was cold and loud and full of men who took one look at a 22-year-old woman alone with a carpetbag and made assumptions that curdled her stomach. She had found the post of housekeeper with a Dr. Harlan in Pueblo, a different Dr. Harlan than the one in Pennsylvania, which the universe apparently found amusing. She had kept that position for 6 months, which ended when Mrs. Harlan's sister arrived from St. Louis, needing both the room Belle occupied and the wages Belle drew. She had spent 3 weeks in Pueblo after that, surviving on carefully rationed savings, scanning every notice board in town. The Garrison advertisement had been the only one that offered real wages for real work. She had sent a letter. She had received no response. She had calculated that 4 miles was walkable in a single afternoon and had simply come. Now she stood in the kitchen of the Garrison ranch house, which was large and well-built and absolutely devastated by neglect. The iron stove was coated in grease. The floor had not been swept in what appeared to be weeks. Dishes were stacked in a way that suggested they had been placed rather than washed, waiting for something. The whole house had the particular feeling of a place that had once been cared for deeply, and then, in a single moment, stopped being cared for at all. Abraham Garrison poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and set it on the table without ceremony. "Sit," he said. Belle sat. She drank the water. She did not look at the state of the kitchen because she did not want to make him feel observed. But she catalogued everything with the quiet efficiency that was simply how her mind worked. There was a woman's apron hanging on a hook near the door, dusty but intact. There were curtains on the kitchen window, faded blue calico, the kind a woman chooses. There were 2 chairs at the kitchen table. Only one had a worn patch on the seat from daily use. "How long?" Belle asked, and then immediately wondered if she had overstepped. Abraham looked at her sharply. "How long what?" "How long has the ranch been without a housekeeper?" His jaw worked. 4 months. He did not offer more, and Belle did not press, but she understood now why the house felt like a held breath. Someone had left, or someone had been lost, and the emptiness they had left was still raw and still present, hanging in every corner like smoke that had not quite cleared. "I can start today," Belle said. "I will not require my first week's wages until the work is established. You can decide at the end of the week whether you want to keep me on." "I'm not worried about the wages," Abraham said, and the irritation in his voice had shifted slightly, becoming something more complicated. "I'm worried about you being here at all." "Why?" He sat down across from her, setting his hat on the table between them. His hands were large and calloused and very still in the way that hands are still when their owner is actively preventing them from doing something, from running through hair, from pressing against a table edge, from revealing something. "This is not an easy place," he said finally. "It is not a place for a woman alone." "I have gathered that the West is not especially comfortable," Belle said. "I came anyway." Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, more like the first small crack in a wall of ice that has been holding back something much warmer beneath. "What's your name?" "Belle Ford." "How old are you, Miss Ford?" 23. He nodded slowly as if this answered something. "I'm 31, he said, which she had not asked, but which he offered anyway, and she found that telling in a way she could not immediately name. "The work is real. It's not light. I have 12 ranch hands who need feeding 3 times a day, a house that needs managing, accounts that have gotten away from me, and 400 head of cattle that don't care what time of year it is. I understand. I have a man named Cutter who serves as foreman and who will not be pleased to see a woman on the property. He's not dangerous," Abraham added quickly, "just set in his thinking." "I have managed men set in their thinking before," Belle said. Another small crack appeared in that expression, not quite a smile. The suggestion of a smile, the way you might suggest a door exists by the shape of light around it. "I expect you have," he said. "Then the wage is $8 a month with room and board. The room is off the kitchen, small but private." $8 a month was lower than she had hoped. It was higher than nothing, which was what she currently had. "I accept." Abraham Garrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat and stood. "The cook stove needs blacking," he said. "The flue is probably clogged. There's a store of wood and coal out back. The well is 30 feet east of the barn. I'll be in the south pasture until sundown if you need anything." He paused at the door. "You won't find the house in the state you might expect." "I have already begun not expecting things," Belle said. He left without another word. Belle sat alone in the ruined kitchen for exactly 30 seconds, taking in the full scope of what had been left for her. Then she stood, rolled up her sleeves, found an apron on a peg, and started with the stove. She worked until the sky went dark and the oil lamp in the kitchen burned warm and amber, and when Abraham Garrison came through the back door at 8:30, he stopped in the doorway and stood very still. The kitchen floor was clean. The dishes were washed and stacked in proper order. The stove gleamed dully with fresh blacking. The curtains had been beaten free of dust. On the table, which she had found a cloth for in the bottom of a cedar chest, there was a covered plate of beans and salt pork and cornbread, kept warm on the stove's edge. He stood in that doorway for a long time, long enough that Belle, coming from the small room off the kitchen where she had arranged her few belongings, nearly walked into him. "Supper is on the table," she said. "I'll need a full account of provisions in the morning to plan the week. I found your supply ledger in the desk drawer." Abraham was looking at the table. Then he looked at her. His gray eyes were doing something that she could not name and did not try to. "Sit down, Miss Ford," he said quietly. "You've worked today. You can eat too." "I was planning to eat in my room." "This is not a house that requires that," he said, and it came out firm but not unkind, the way a man speaks when he is establishing a rule that costs him something to offer. So Belle Ford sat down across from Abraham Garrison on her first night at the ranch that she did not yet know would one day be as much hers as his. And they ate together in the warm light of the kitchen lamp, not speaking much, but sharing the particular comfortable silence of two people who have both, in their separate ways, been very much alone for a very long time. The morning broke hot and clear, the way Colorado mornings do in late summer, with the light coming fast and total over the eastern bluffs, turning everything gold before the heat could catch it. Belle was up before dawn out of habit and had coffee boiling and biscuits in the cast iron oven before the first ranch hand knocked on the cookhouse door. The cookhouse was a separate building, she discovered, attached to the main house by a covered walkway, which made sense for a working cattle ranch of this size. It had a long table with benches, a larger commercial stove, and enough storage to feed a small army. She would need to master its geography quickly. The ranch hands were 12 in total. She had been warned about Cutter, the foreman, and she found him immediately distinguishable from the others by the particular quality of his silence when he saw her. He was a lean, weathered man of perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and the kind of deliberate stillness that spoke of a man who had opinions he was choosing not to voice, which Belle actually respected more than shouting. "Cutter," she said, setting a platter of biscuits down without ceremony. "I'm Belle Ford. I manage the house and cookhouse. I will need you to tell me if any of your men have dietary complaints that affect their working ability. I won't abide waste, and I won't abide a man going hungry." Cutter looked at her with flat, measuring eyes for a full 3 seconds. Then he reached for a biscuit. "Fair enough," he said, which she would come to understand was the highest form of acceptance in his vocabulary. Abraham appeared in the cookhouse doorway as the men were finishing their second round of coffee, and Belle noticed the way the room settled slightly at his presence, not with fear, but with the natural gravity of a man whose authority was earned rather than assumed. He glanced at her across the table, and there was something briefly open in his expression before he shuttered it. "We're moving the south herd to the upper pasture today," he told Cutter. Then to Belle, "I'll want the accounts after supper if you've had time to look at them." "I'll have them," Belle said. She had them. She spent the middle hours of the day, after the noon meal was served and the kitchen cleaned, with the account ledger spread on the kitchen table. It was a revealing document. The ranch was profitable, genuinely so, with the cattle operation generating healthy returns from the Denver stockyards. But the household accounts were chaotic, entries made in two different hands, and then a gap of 4 months where nothing was recorded at all. The gap that matched the absence Abraham had admitted to. Belle organized what she could, flagged what needed clarification, and prepared a neat summary. When Abraham came in that evening, she presented it without preamble. He sat down and read it with the focused attention of a man who understood numbers. Then he looked up. "Where did you learn accounting?" "My father was a company clerk. He taught me figures from the time I could hold a pen. I also managed Dr. Harlan's household accounts in Pueblo." Abraham set the ledger down. He was looking at her again with that expression she was beginning to map, the one where something was trying to come through the wall and he was deciding whether to let it. "This is better than I've had in 2 years," he said. "Even before. The word sat between them like a stone. Belle did not ask. She was beginning to understand that Abraham Garrison's before was not a place he invited visitors, and that pressing him there would be the surest way to close every door she had slowly, carefully, begun to inch open. Instead, she pointed to a line item in the ledger. "Your credit at Marston's General in town is extended by $40. You should settle that before winter." "I know," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll ride in on Friday. I can prepare a supply list. It would be more efficient to bring everything in one trip." He looked at her. "Do you always work like this?" "Like what?" "Like there's a fire that needs to be outrun." Belle was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 3 weeks in Pueblo, the way she had counted her coins each night and rearranged them as if the counting might change the number. She thought about the post office notice board and the advertisement that had offered, in its plain and practical language, the possibility of stability. "Yes," she finally said, "I suppose I do." Abraham nodded slowly. He did not press either. They were both, Belle realized, people who respected the privacy of wounds. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Belle managed the household and the cookhouse with the kind of total competence that comes not from ease but from genuine love of order, of things working the way they should, of problems identified and solved. She learned the ranch's geography, the south pasture and the upper pasture, the creek that fed the lower cattle tank, the section of fence near the eastern ridge that Cutter had been meaning to repair for 3 months. She learned the names and characters of all 12 ranch hands. She kept the accounts. She organized the supply closet. She baked bread twice a week and made certain that the lamp oil was always full and the woodbox always stocked for winter. Abraham watched all of this with a quality of attention that Belle gradually became aware of, in the way you gradually become aware of warmth from a fire, not all at once, but as a slow, pervasive thing that eventually you notice has changed the temperature of everything. He began to leave small things. A bunch of wildflowers placed on the kitchen table without comment or attribution, though he was the only one who went to the south meadow where those particular yellow flowers grew. A book left on the bench in the covered walkway, a collection of poetry that she suspected he had not actually read, but had noticed her glancing at in the small bookcase in the sitting room. A second lantern placed in her room when he found her squinting at the accounts by a single candle's light. Belle filed these offerings carefully in the private ledger of her heart, alongside equal and opposite entries. The way he always knocked before opening her door. The way he addressed her as Miss Ford in front of the hands, and then, in the kitchen when they were alone, had once, just once, almost called her Belle, catching himself at the B with a small tightening of his jaw that she had pretended not to notice. The way he asked for her opinion on things that had nothing to do with her job, which pasture for the winter herd, whether the creek fence should be cottonwood or cedar, whether Cutter's youngest nephew might be a suitable addition to the spring crew. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know a river's direction without standing in it, by the pull of everything around it. She also knew that he was carrying something that she had not yet seen the shape of, something that was not quite grief and not quite guilt but had elements of both, and that until she understood that thing, she could not know what the love would cost. The answer came on a Thursday in September, 6 weeks into her time at the ranch, from an unexpected direction. Eliza Garrison arrived in a hired buckboard from the Caldera Flats station, unannounced. The way family arrives when they have decided that announcing themselves gives the recipient too much time to prepare a defense. She was younger than Abraham by perhaps 5 years, with his same dark hair and a much more open version of his face, all the feeling he kept locked showing freely in her. She came through the door of the main house and stopped when she saw Belle, and the expression she wore was so complicated that Belle had to look away. "You actually came," Eliza said, "not to Belle, to the room, or perhaps to whatever version of hope she had been nurturing since she had written that letter." "I came on my own account," Belle said. "I answered an advertisement." Eliza blinked. Then she laughed, a surprised and genuine sound. "Of course you did. He actually put out an advertisement." She shook her head. "My brother is the most stubborn man in Colorado territory." "He mentioned you," Belle offered carefully. "Only bad things, I'm certain." Eliza set down her bag and looked at the kitchen with wide eyes, taking in the clean floor, the organized shelves, the faint smell of the bread Belle had pulled from the oven an hour ago. "You've done wonders in here." "It required work, not wonders." Eliza looked at her then, really looked, with the direct and measuring quality that she apparently shared with her brother, the Garrison way of taking accurate inventory. "What has he told you?" she asked. "About why he needed help?" "Nothing." Eliza sat down at the kitchen table. Belle poured coffee because that was what you did and sat across from her because it seemed like the conversation required sitting. "His wife died," Eliza said, plain and direct, no softening around the edges. "Catherine, 8 months ago in January. She was carrying their first child and neither of them survived." Belle was quiet. The room was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark was singing its high liquid song from somewhere near the barn, and it was almost too much beauty for such a heavy fact to sit inside. "He has not," Eliza continued, turning her coffee cup in her hands, "been right since. Not wrong exactly, nothing that frightens me in that way, but closed. Gone inside himself somewhere that I cannot reach. He has 12 men depending on this ranch for their livelihoods, and he is keeping it running through pure stubbornness, and working himself into the ground every day so that when he finally sleeps, he sleeps too hard to dream." She looked at Belle. "I wrote to a woman I knew in Pueblo because I thought that if there was someone here, someone to manage the house so he didn't have to feel its emptiness every moment, it might help." He called it meddling. "He threw my letter in the fire. And yet here I am," Belle said softly. "And yet here you are," Eliza agreed. She was quiet a moment. "Is he eating? Every meal, he works hard." "He is not neglecting himself if that is your concern." Eliza nodded, something releasing in her shoulders. "Is he unkind to you?" "No." Belle thought about the wildflowers on the table, the book in the walkway, the second lantern. "He has been generous." Eliza was watching her with those measuring eyes. "You like him," she said, not accusing, observing, almost wondering. Belle met her gaze steadily. "He is a good man doing the best he can with a situation that has cost him enormously. Yes, I like him." Eliza smiled then, and it transformed her face into something luminous. "Good," she said simply, and lifted her coffee. Abraham came in from the pasture at sundown to find his sister sitting in the kitchen, and the expression on his face when he saw her was so layered, annoyance and relief and love and grief and something that might have been shame, all stacked on top of each other like geological strata, that Belle quietly took herself to the cookhouse to give them privacy. She heard raised voices at one point, Abraham's low and hard, Eliza's higher and holding its ground, then silence. Then, much later, the low register of two people talking in a different register entirely. The way family talks when they have gotten through the argument and arrived at the real conversation underneath. Eliza stayed 3 days. In those 3 days, Belle observed Abraham Garrison in a new way, with the new knowledge of Catherine and the child sitting behind her eyes, shifting the way she interpreted everything she saw. the worn patch on the other chair at the kitchen table, the woman's apron on its hook, the two different hands in the accounts ledger, one of them in a small, tidy script that was not Abraham's. She understood now why the house had felt like a held breath. It was not just neglect. It was a place where someone had been present so fully that their absence had physical weight. She ached for him. Not with pity, which she thought he would hate, but with genuine sorrow, the kind you carry for someone who has been handed more than any reasonable amount of grief and has insisted on remaining upright anyway. The morning Eliza left, Abraham drove her to the station himself. Belle watched the wagon disappear down the long road toward town and then turned back to her work. At noon he came back alone and was very quiet at lunch, eating without his usual brief observations about the day's work. Belle was washing dishes when he came to stand in the kitchen doorway. She knew he was there before she heard him, some new awareness of him that had been developing whether she invited it or not. "She told you," he said. Belle set a plate in the drying rack. "Yes." "I'm sorry," he said. "That was mine to tell or not to tell. You don't owe me an explanation." "No," a pause, "but I feel I do, which is different." Another pause longer. "Catherine was a good woman. She came here from Kansas with more optimism than I deserved, and she made this place into something I didn't know I'd been wanting until it existed. And then she was gone, and I did not know how to be in it anymore." He said all of this to the middle distance, not to Belle. The way you say difficult things when you cannot yet look at the person you are saying them to. "I did not want anyone here because I thought I would see her in everything a woman did in this house. The cooking, the curtains, the way the lamp gets lit at dusk." Belle turned from the dishes. She looked at him directly because she thought he needed to be looked at directly. "And do you," she asked, "see her?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he met her eyes, what she saw there was something raw and very real and very present. "No," he said, "I see you." Belle Ford was not, by nature, a person who blushed. She had a composed nature and a steady temperament and 4 months of genuine emotional self-discipline that she had built specifically to navigate this situation without making a fool of herself. All of that held. But something did happen in her chest in that moment, a warm and quiet opening, like a door that has been carefully latched against the weather finally allowed to swing on its hinges. "Good," she said, which was apparently the Garrison family response to significant things, and returned to her dishes. October arrived in Colorado like a declaration. The aspens on the high slopes turned gold and then copper, and then the wind took them, and the mornings went sharp and cold, and the cattle were moved to the lower winter pastures, and the whole ranch settled into the different but no less urgent rhythm of preparation for hard weather. Belle laid in provisions with the calculated thoroughness of someone who had learned not to trust that supply would follow demand. She put up preserves from the kitchen garden, organized the root cellar, made certain the wood stores were deep enough, helped Cutter check the weatherproofing on the bunkhouse roof. Abraham worked alongside his men from first light to last, which was his habitual mode, but there was something changing in the quality of his presence in the house after Catherine's history had been spoken aloud. He was not lighter exactly. Grief doesn't simply lighten on schedule, but he was more present, more available to the moments as they happened rather than living slightly behind them. He began to talk to Belle at supper, not about the ranch, or not only about the ranch. About his childhood in Missouri, which he had left at 18 with his father's tacit blessing and his mother's explicit worry. About the years he had spent working other men's cattle before saving enough to start his own operation. About Eliza, who had followed him west after her own marriage ended in a quiet mutual sadness, and who lived now in Denver running a school for children, which was exactly the kind of purposeful thing that Eliza would do with her formidable energy. And Belle talked back. Not guarded, not performing, but actually talking, the way she had not talked to anyone in a very long time. About her father and his careful penmanship, and his habit of humming while he worked. About her mother, who had loved to read poetry aloud after supper, which was why Belle had grown up believing that words put in the right order were a form of prayer. About the school in Harrisburg, where she had taught the children of miners how to decode a world that had not been designed with them in mind. About the particular loneliness of being young and without anchor, and surrounded by people who assumed that a woman alone was a problem waiting for a man to solve it. "You don't seem like a problem," Abraham said one evening in October, over coffee gone cool while they talked past the hour they should have stopped. He said it with a directness that was characteristic of him but layered now with something warmer, a quality of attention that was almost shy, which was the last thing you would expect from a man who was not shy about anything else. "I have had my share of problems," Belle said. "I simply prefer to solve them from the inside rather than wait for rescue." He smiled. It was, she thought, one of the finest things she had ever seen, not because it was beautiful, though it was in its quiet, slow-breaking way, but because she knew now how rarely he allowed it, and so it had weight. "I have noticed that," he said. "Is that a complaint?" "Oh," he said, and the warmth in that single word was enough to keep her warm the entire cold walk across the covered walkway to her room. Cutter thawed by degrees, in the way that permafrost thaws, slowly and from the bottom up. The first sign was that he began leaving his coffee cup specifically where Belle could see it needed refilling rather than getting up himself, which she recognized as a small but significant acknowledgement that her presence had been accepted into his understanding of the ranch's order. The second sign was that he sought her out one morning in November to ask, with studied casualness, whether she had any experience with a particular kind of wound poultice, because one of the younger hands had taken a cut on his forearm from a barbed wire fence, and Cutter was not satisfied with how it was healing. Belle cleaned and dressed the wound with the competence she had developed through years of practical necessity, and Cutter watched with expressionless approval, and after that he treated her with the quiet and particular respect he extended to things that had proven their usefulness in critical moments. The younger hands, for their part, had accepted her immediately. Young men on a working cattle ranch have a clear-eyed appreciation for good food and a managed household that transcends any prejudice against female competence. She learned their stories, the way you learn people's stories when you feed them regularly and listen without agenda. Two of them were brothers from Texas. One was a former soldier who had come west to put distance between himself and the war's memories. One was 19 and desperately homesick, and tried to hide it by being louder than the others, and Belle made sure his biscuits were always slightly larger and never said a word about it. In November, a thing happened that changed the dynamic of the ranch entirely and brought Belle and Abraham into a new proximity that was both practically necessary and emotionally significant. A late-season storm came down from the mountains without warning, the kind that did not announce itself through the usual gradual buildup, but arrived in the night like a verdict. By morning there were 18 inches of snow and a wind that made venturing to the barn a genuine exercise in navigation by intuition. 3 of the younger hands were stranded at the line camp in the upper pasture. Cutter and 4 others were managing the cattle in the lower pasture, which was essential work that could not be stopped. Abraham was riding between positions, coordinating, which left no one in the cookhouse. Belle managed the cookhouse alone for 2 days, keeping a fire in both stoves, keeping food available at all hours because men coming in from the cold in wet clothes need hot food immediately and on demand. She did not sleep more than 4 hours either night. She kept the lamp burning in the window that faced the barn, which was something she did without consciously deciding to, some instinct about light in darkness. On the second night of the storm, Abraham came in from the cold at 2 in the morning, covered in snow down to his eyebrows, and stood in the cookhouse doorway. And Belle was at the stove and turned around, and they looked at each other for a moment that contained something much larger than either of them was ready to name. She made him sit. She pulled off his outer coat and his hat, which he allowed without protest, which told her something about the state he was in. She put a bowl of stew in front of him and stood beside the stove while he ate, not crowding him but not leaving either, and the small cookhouse was warm and tight against the roaring dark outside, and she was so acutely, precisely aware of him that she thought it must be visible, some physical glow of awareness. "Are the men safe?" she asked. "All of them. The 3 at the upper camp have the line cabin, they'll be fine. The others are rotating in the barn to keep the cattle calm." He ate another spoonful. "You've been up all night." "I've been needed all night." He looked up from his bowl. "Belle, her name, the full thing, not Miss Ford." Just her name, spoken quietly with a quality of attention she felt in her sternum. "You don't have to run yourself into the ground on our account." "I'm not running," she said. "I am precisely where I choose to be." Abraham was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "I'm beginning to believe that is entirely true." Another pause. "I'm also beginning to hope it continues to be." Belle gripped the handle of the ladle she was holding with unnecessary firmness. "It will," she said. "I have nowhere else I want to be." The storm broke the following afternoon, leaving the world bright and cold and clean, and the ranch returned to its winter rhythm, and nothing was formally said, nothing declared or named, but something had shifted as definitively as the snow had, a permanent alteration in the landscape. December arrived, and with it came a problem that Belle had not anticipated: a man named Harwood Slade. Slade was a land agent, or he presented himself as such, and he arrived at the ranch on a Thursday in mid-December with a hired man who stood outside and did not come in, which Belle noted as a detail that did not sit well. Slade himself was a smooth-talking individual in an expensive coat that did not match the weather or the setting, with the kind of constant, easy smile that Belle had learned meant a man who never showed his real face. Abraham received him in the sitting room, and Belle, who was mending in the hallway by the sitting room door for reasons that were adjacent to eavesdropping, but which she preferred to frame as efficient use of proximity, heard enough. Slade was representing a cattle consortium from St. Louis that was buying up range land in Colorado Territory. He had a price for the Garrison Ranch that was genuinely high, higher than the land's fair market value, which Belle knew from the accounts, and he presented it with the warmth and confidence of a man who expected acceptance. Abraham listened without interrupting. Then Abraham said, "No." Slade's smile did not falter. He restated the offer with a small increase. Abraham said no again. Slade said he hoped Mr. Garrison would reconsider, given that the consortium had some legal questions about the eastern water rights on this property, questions that might take some time to resolve in court, and that time could be quite costly for a cattle operation that depended on that water source. Belle set down her mending. She walked to the sitting room doorway. "Mr. Slade," she said. Both men looked at her. Slade's expression adjusted to accommodate her, a quick recalibration, a different kind of smile. "Ma'am." The Eastern water rights were registered with the Colorado Territory Land Office in 1878 and renewed in 1880. The documentation is in the ranch's file, which I organized last month. Any legal challenge to those rights would require a competing claim that predates 1878, and given that this land was open federal range before Mr. Garrison filed his homestead claim, I am confident no such claim exists. She met Slade's eyes steadily. "You are welcome to test that confidence in the courts if you wish. It will not trouble us." There was a silence. Slade looked at her, then he looked at Abraham. Abraham was looking at Belle with an expression she had not seen from him before, one she did not immediately have a word for, something between astonishment and recognition and a fierce private pride. "I see," Slade said, and stood and gathered his hat. "We may be in touch, Mr. Garrison." "Write a letter," Abraham said. "Miss Ford handles our correspondence." Slade left. They heard the hired man's horse start up, and then the sound of them going. Abraham turned to Belle in the sitting room and looked at her for a long moment. "You were eavesdropping," he said. "I was mending in the hallway. You were listening at my sitting room door." "I have an excellent memory and an efficient method of working," Belle said. "The two sometimes coincide in useful ways." Abraham laughed. A real laugh, not the almost smile, not the suggestion of warmth, but an actual laugh, full-throated and surprised, and it filled the sitting room, and Belle felt it in every part of her, and thought that if she could choose one sound to carry with her for the rest of her life, it might be that one. "Belle Ford," he said, after the laugh had settled, still smiling, the warmth of it remaining in his face, "you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time." "I am a practical person," she said, because her throat had gone slightly unreliable and practical was the safest register to use. "You are," he agreed, and then more quietly, stepping slightly closer in the afternoon-dim sitting room, the winter light coming gray and soft through the calico curtains that had been Catherine's, and which Belle had never touched because they were not hers to touch, but which in that moment she thought perhaps she might one day. "You are also considerably more than that." Belle looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cold room. "Abraham," she said. His name, not Mr. Garrison, just his name, trying it out like a new key in a familiar lock. His breath changed. Something in him seemed to come fully forward, fully present, for the first time in all the weeks she had known him. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to begin again. I thought I understood grief, but it turns out I only understood the first kind. I don't know what I am doing." "Neither do I," Belle said. "I came here for work, that is all I intended." "I know," he said. "I offered you work, that is all I intended." They were quiet, standing in the winter-light sitting room in the space between what they had intended and what had arrived. "I think," Belle said carefully, "that we are both in new territory." "Yes," Abraham said. "I think," Belle said, with the particular precision she applied to accounting and to truth, "that I would like to explore it." He reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and calloused and very warm, and he held hers with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the size of it, the way strong things are gentle specifically because they know their own strength. "So would I," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," Belle Ford said, and meant it with every precise and ordered and quietly longing part of herself. They did not tell the ranch hands immediately, because there was nothing formal to tell. What had changed between them was real but unannounced, a warm and private thing they were tending like a new fire that had not yet established itself well enough to be trusted in a wind. What changed in the house was the space between them. They had always been close. The proximity of a small household enforces closeness, but now there was a different quality to it. He would come into the kitchen in the morning and she would not hear him, but somehow know he was there, turning before he spoke. He would sit at the table across from her when she was doing accounts and sometimes reach over to point to a figure or a line, and the brief nearness of his hand would make her entire mind go briefly and productively blank. He asked her to walk with him one Sunday afternoon in December, through the lower pasture where the cattle stood in their winter stoicism, their breath clouding in the cold. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets and told her about the first winter on this land, before the house was properly built, when he and 2 hired men had lived in a dugout and nearly frozen in a January storm that would have killed them if the cattle had not generated enough heat to survive. "You have always been determined to make this place work," Belle said. "It is the only place that has ever felt fully mine," he said. "Before it existed, I was just passing through everything." Belle walked beside him on the frozen ground and thought about passing through things versus staying in them, about the difference between a life made of movement and a life made of roots, and whether it was possible to be a person built for both, someone who had moved because they had to and would choose to stay because they wanted to. "Do you ever regret coming west?" he asked. "I was asked that question, essentially, by my uncle in his letter," Belle said. "He thought it was a land of opportunity." "He was wrong about the specifics, but right about the essential thing, I think." "What is the essential thing?" She looked out across the cattle, across the winter pasture, to the high bluffs standing red and enormous against the December sky. "That the distance required to find the right place is worth the finding," she said, "even if the distance is large." Abraham stopped walking. He turned to look at her and the winter light was on his face and he said, "Is this the right place, Belle?" She turned to face him. "I believe it might be," she said. "I believe I am still finding out." He nodded, and something in his face settled, some long-held tension releasing at its foundations. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back under her hat, an intimate small gesture so carefully and gently performed that it made her breath stop entirely. "Take your time," he said. "I am not going anywhere." Christmas at the Garrison Ranch was, in practice, a communal event. Belle organized it with the same methodical care she brought to everything. A proper Christmas dinner for all the hands, decorations made from what the land offered, pine boughs from the creek stand and red berries from the hillside, and a paper chain that the youngest hand helped her cut, and paste in a moment of domestic silliness that she suspected he would deny vigorously to anyone who asked. Eliza sent a package from Denver, fabric and a new set of account books, and a letter to Belle that was warm and conspiratorial and made Belle laugh, and then press her hand against her mouth to contain the laugh, because she was alone in the kitchen and laughter alone can tip into something else. Abraham gave Belle a gift on Christmas morning, before the hands arrived for breakfast. He knocked on her door and she opened it to find him holding a small package wrapped in brown paper, looking slightly uncertain, which was such an endearingly unfamiliar expression on his face that she had to work to keep her own composed. It was a book. A collection of American poetry, new, not borrowed from his shelf, chosen. Inside the cover, in his careful blocky hand, was written simply, "For the woman who makes this house into something worth coming home to." A.G. Belle stood in her doorway holding the book and felt something very large and very irrevocable settle in her chest, like a stone dropped into deep water that would not come back up, and did not want to. She gave him the gift she had made, a careful reproduction of the ranch's accounts for the full year since she had arrived, neatly bound, with a note at the front that read, "So you can see clearly what this place is worth and what it might become. B.F." It was perhaps not what a woman in a more conventional story would have given the man she was falling in love with, but Abraham Garrison looked at it the way a man looks at something that has understood him exactly, and that was better. January was hard and cold and beautiful, and the months between January and April were the months that revealed the true character of a place, when the romance of the landscape had been replaced by its honesty. The work never stopped. The cold was a genuine physical force that required daily management. Cattle needed to be checked, fences repaired in weather that made every tool handle painful to grip. The supplies had to be rationed and monitored. Belle and Abraham worked alongside each other with the particular ease of two people who have found that their rhythms are compatible, who have discovered that their individual systems of organization and priority fit together, without requiring either to diminish. They disagreed sometimes. She thought a particular supply purchase was unnecessary expense. He thought her plan for the spring kitchen garden was overambitious, and they argued about it in the direct way of people who respect each other enough not to soften the argument, and they generally ended up at something better than either position had been individually. She learned more of him in those winter months. She learned that he read seriously and widely, the bookcase in the sitting room representing not decoration but actual engagement. She learned that he was patient with the young hands in a way that Cutter was not, spending time he didn't strictly have to explain things twice, 3 times, without irritation. She learned that he played a harmonica, badly and with great enjoyment, usually in the barn when he thought no one could hear him, and she had stood in the covered walkway one evening in February listening to him play a hymn so imperfectly that it became somehow more moving than the perfect version would have been. She learned that he had a habit of touching the doorframe when he entered a room, just the briefest contact with the wood, which she thought was probably not something he knew he did. She learned that he preferred his coffee stronger than was strictly reasonable, and that he would not eat raisins under any circumstances, a fixed position for which he declined to offer any explanation. She learned, most essentially, that he was trying. Every day, in the small ways that constitute the actual substance of a life, he was trying to be present, to be whole, to let Catherine's absence be a real thing that he carried and mourned without letting it be the only thing. Belle watched this with a quiet and steady admiration that was part of her love for him, because she understood the effort it took to continue, having done her own version of it, and she knew that the trying was not defeat but a form of courage. In March, Abraham asked her to walk to the South Meadow. It was a Sunday, and the day was one of those early March days that promises spring without quite delivering it, cold still but with a new quality of light, something opening in the sky above the bluffs. The yellow flowers that grew in the South Meadow would not be out for another 6 weeks, but the grass was beginning to green at the creek's edge, and the aspens were showing the faintest fuzz of new buds. They walked without the need to fill the silence, which was the particular comfort of their relationship at this stage, the ease of shared quiet. When they reached the South Meadow, Abraham stopped and stood looking out at the open land with the particular stillness that meant he was gathering himself for something. Belle waited. She had learned to wait for him. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what this place needs, what it's been missing." He turned to face her. He was not looking at the middle distance. He was looking at her directly and fully. "I have been thinking about what I am missing." Belle's heart was very clear and very steady and very loud. "Abraham, I know what I said in the beginning," he said. "I told you I didn't need anyone here. I told myself the same thing for months before that. I was wrong." He exhaled. "I don't want to offer you employment anymore, Belle. That's not what this is. That's not what you are to me. I know it's not simple. I know there are things I carry that are heavy and things about the future that I cannot promise with certainty, because no one can." He paused. "But I can promise you that this is where I want you to be. Not as my housekeeper, not as my cook or my account manager, though God knows you are better at all of those things than anyone I have ever employed." Another pause and a slight unevenness in his voice that she had never heard before, the sound of a man placing something very precious down on an uncertain surface and waiting to see if it holds. "As my wife, if you would have me. If this is a place you would choose, knowing everything it has been and everything it might become." Belle Ford stood in the early March South Meadow of the Garrison Ranch, in the particular thin and promising light of a Colorado spring still arriving, and looked at the man who had met her in crisis and offered her work, and then, without intending to, offered her considerably more. And thought about all the ways she had moved through the world since her father died and her mother followed, and her uncle's letter brought her west into the enormous uncertain country where nothing had been what she expected and everything had been, somehow, exactly right. "You said," she said carefully, "in the beginning that you offered me work and that was all you intended." "Yes," he said. "And I said I came here for work and that was all I intended." "Yes." "We were both incorrect," Belle said. "We were both incorrect," Abraham agreed. The not-quite smile was present, and in it she could see the real smile waiting, held back by the bare possibility that she might say no. She did not say no. "Yes," she said, "I would have you, I would choose this, I would choose you." The real smile arrived. She had been right about it. It was the finest thing she had ever seen, wide and warm and real. And when he took her face in both his large and calloused hands and kissed her in the South Meadow with the spring light coming down and the creek running cold and bright, she thought that all the distances she had traveled had been, every single mile of them, worth this exact arriving. They were married in April, when the yellow flowers were finally out in the South Meadow. Eliza came from Denver and wept openly during the brief ceremony performed by the minister from Caldera Flats, dabbing her eyes with no apparent self-consciousness and squeezing Belle's hand so hard before the ceremony that Belle's fingers went slightly white. Cutter stood with the hands and wore his best shirt and managed not to change his expression at all, which Belle had come to understand was Cutter's version of radiant happiness. The hands had decorated the cookhouse for the dinner afterward with the available materials of a working cattle ranch, which resulted in a celebration that was genuine if not particularly elegant, and which was better for it. The youngest hand, the homesick one from Texas, had somehow procured a fiddle and played it with enthusiastic and imprecise energy, and Belle and Abraham danced on the packed earth outside the cookhouse in the April evening, while the stars appeared one by one in the enormous Colorado sky. She wore a dress that Eliza had brought from a shop in Denver, blue cotton with white trim, practical enough for the world she was entering but fine enough to mark the day as what it was. Abraham had put on his good coat and combed his hair and looked at her when she came out of her room in that dress, her room that would not be her room after today but theirs, and the look on his face was one she was quite certain she would carry until she died. Belle Garrison. She tried the name in her mind as they danced. It was not a difficult fit. The first year of their marriage was one of the happiest years Belle had known, and she had enough honest perspective to recognize that happiness of this quality is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of someone to face difficulty with. There were hard things. The spring cattle drive brought the expected losses, and the summer was drier than hoped, and the price at the Denver stockyards was lower than the previous year. One of the ranch hands, the former soldier, left to go back east to family, and they missed him. A fence section in the upper pasture gave way in a summer storm and cost 2 weeks of repair work and 3 head of cattle. But there were also the mornings. The particular morning light through the bedroom curtains, blue calico that Belle had at last, gently and with Abraham's quiet blessing, replaced with white cotton, a new beginning rather than a covering over, and he had agreed without hesitation, which told her everything she needed to know about where he was in his carrying. The evenings in the sitting room with the lamp burning and both of them reading, him with his history, her with her poetry, the comfortable shared silence of two people who have chosen each other and are at peace with the choosing. The accounts, now kept together, as she had begun to think of most things. She managed them and shared the decisions, and Abraham had discovered in the first month of their marriage that she had opinions about the cattle operation that were both informed and occasionally right, and had adjusted accordingly, which was not something every man of his time and place would have done. But then, Belle thought, she had not married every man of his time and place. In October of 1883, which was 14 months after Belle had walked 4 miles with a carpetbag and a crumpled letter to ask for work, she told Abraham that they were going to have a child. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning, over coffee. She had chosen the kitchen because it was the room where everything real happened, where they had first sat across from each other and begun the slow process of knowing each other, and it seemed right that this news should live in the same space. Abraham set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. His face went through several things very rapidly, and Belle watched each of them pass, knowing what some of them were about, knowing he was thinking of Catherine, knowing that joy and fear can occupy the same moment in a man who has had reason to learn that good things can be taken. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "I am strong," she said. "I am healthy. I have an excellent constitution and a completely irrational stubbornness about surviving." He turned his hand over and clasped hers. "You do," he said roughly. "We are going to be all right," she said. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed them against her knuckles, a gesture she had not seen from him before, and it carried everything he was not saying, the fear and the hope and the enormous, tender ferocity of a man who loves something that can be taken and chooses to love it anyway. "Yes," he said, "we are." Spring came to the Garrison Ranch in 1884 with the particular extravagance that sometimes follows a hard winter, everything blooming at once as if making up for lost time. The south meadow was full of the yellow flowers. The aspens were loudly, vividly green. The creek ran high and cold and bright. In May, Belle's son was born, a healthy, large, and extremely vocal boy who arrived in the world with the kind of no-nonsense enthusiasm that suggested he had places to be. The doctor from Caldera Flats attended, and Eliza, who had come 3 weeks early to be there, was in the house, and Abraham held Belle's hand through the labor with a white-knuckled steadiness that she thought cost him more than anything he had ever done on horseback or in a storm. When the doctor placed the baby in Abraham's arms, something happened in Abraham Garrison's face that Belle would spend the rest of her life being grateful she was present to witness. Not just joy. Something deeper, some fundamental reorganization of what a man believes is possible for himself. Some permission he had not known he needed to believe that what had been taken could also be given back in a different form. He looked at the baby and then he looked at Belle, and the tears on his face were the most honest thing she had ever seen. "He has your eyes," Abraham said. "They're dark, like yours." "He has your hands," Belle said. "Look at those hands. He is going to be enormous." They named him Douglas, for Belle's father, and the choice was made in the span of approximately 30 seconds of mutual agreement, in the way that the right decision usually announces itself, without argument, with a feeling of settled rightness. Douglas Garrison was, from the first week of his life, a person of very decided opinions, and he grew into his opinion-having with the dedicated energy of a child who has inherited stubbornness from both parents. He was walking at 10 months and talking at 13, and asking questions that required genuine intellectual effort to answer by the time he was 2. Abraham, who had not known he would be the kind of father who told long and elaborate stories, discovered that he was exactly that kind of father, and Belle would often fall asleep to the low murmur of Abraham's voice in the next room, spinning some improbable tale of cowboys and cattle and mysterious Western territory that Douglas received with absorbed credulity. Eliza visited several times a year and spoiled Douglas systematically and without apology, and Douglas adored her with the unconditional passion of a child for the adult who arrives bearing gifts and the best stories and no disciplinary authority whatsoever. Cutter, who had thawed completely by the first winter after Belle arrived and had been warm, in his particular expressionless way, ever since, developed a gruff tenderness for the baby that he displayed by always knowing exactly where the child was, and occasionally appearing to perform minor repairs near wherever Douglas happened to be playing, in a vigilance that was both practical and touching. The ranch expanded in 1885. Abraham bought the adjoining 50 acres to the east, which included the disputed water rights that Harwood Slade's consortium had once tried to threaten, and which Belle took a small, tidy satisfaction in adding to the accounts. They hired 2 additional hands. They improved the barn. They built a proper wash house separate from the main house. Belle suggested they also build a proper schoolroom, a single room attached to the house that could serve Douglas when he was old enough, and potentially the children of the hands who were beginning to settle with families of their own. Abraham agreed before she finished the proposal, which was characteristic of him by now, meeting her ideas with the particular directness of a man who trusts his wife's judgment without requiring her to earn it fresh each time. They wrote to Eliza about the schoolroom. Eliza wrote back a letter of such sustained enthusiasm that it took 3 pages. In the autumn of 1886, Belle told Abraham that there would be another child. This time the telling was different, easier, the fear still present in him but less overwhelming, crowded out by the evidence of Douglas, who was 2 and thriving, and entirely convincing proof that good things could in fact be held. Their daughter arrived in February of 1887, delivered with less drama than her brother and considerably more curiosity, opening her eyes to survey the situation with the alert and assessing look of someone taking careful inventory. Abraham declared immediately that she had Belle's look of measuring everything, which Belle considered accurate and Abraham considered charming. They named her Clara for no particular reason except that it suited her, and she was, from the beginning, a different creature than Douglas entirely, quieter and more watchful where he was loud and immediate, content to observe the world at length before engaging with it, which made her, Belle thought, an extremely good scientist or possibly a very troubling card player. Douglas was fascinated by his sister in the way that very small and very energetic children are fascinated by very small and very still ones, which is to say obsessively and somewhat inefficiently, standing over her basket making faces until she deigned to respond. Abraham watched this with the expression Belle had catalogued as his private joy face, the one he deployed only when he thought no one was looking, though she was always looking, because she found him as endlessly interesting to watch as she had on the first day. The years settled into each other with the particular texture of a good life being lived forward, days with difficulty in them and days of simple ease and seasons that brought their different demands. And through all of it the ranch grew, and the family grew, and Belle Ford, who had walked 4 miles in the August heat with a carpetbag and a crumpled letter, and nothing but the intention to ask for work, found that she had been given something so much larger than she had asked for that the asking seemed, in retrospect, impossibly small. She did not think of herself as lucky exactly. Luck implied passivity, something that arrived without effort or deserving. What she felt was something more active than that, a gratitude that came with the awareness of how many decisions, her own and his, had led to this. How many moments of choice to remain rather than retreat, to speak rather than stay silent, to extend a hand rather than keep it safe. She thought about this sometimes on the quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was settling into its nighttime sounds, the low voices of the hands finishing their day, a horse shifting in the barn, the wind moving through the aspens on the creek bank. She and Abraham would sit in the sitting room with the lamp burning between them, the new white cotton curtains soft at the windows, the bookcase full of books they had both read and argued about and marked with their own thoughts in the margins, and she would look at him, and he would look up from whatever he was reading and catch her looking, and that small moment, that catching, was one of the things she loved best about all of it. "What are you thinking about?" he asked one evening in the spring of 1888, catching her. "I came here for work," Belle said. He raised an eyebrow. "I know, you made that very clear." "I was prepared for any work, cooking, cleaning, accounts, horses if necessary. I had a very comprehensive inventory of my own abilities." "You did," he said, with the fully established warm smile that belonged to the settled version of him, the one who had learned to let the good things in. It was somewhat intimidating. "I was not prepared," Belle said, "for any of this, for any of the rest of it." Abraham set his book down. He looked at her with the full attention that she still received from him, the way you receive sunlight, with gratitude and a slight disbelief at the abundance of it. "Are you glad," he asked, "of the rest of it?" Belle thought of Douglas, who was 4 and had recently discovered that he could climb to the top of the fence post by the barn and stand there declaring things to the cattle, and who would probably give his father heart failure before his 5th birthday. She thought of Clara, who was 1 and had recently learned to wave, and exercised this ability at everything she encountered, people, horses, a particularly interesting cloud. She thought of Eliza's letters and Cutter's gruff protective warmth and the 12, now 14, men who had become a kind of extended and unlikely family. She thought of the accounts, balanced and growing. She thought of the south meadow in bloom and the kitchen in the morning and the white cotton curtains in the bedroom and the book of poetry on her nightstand, and the man across from her who had once told her to get off his land and then, because he was fundamentally a good man and she was stubbornly not a person who accepted dismissal, had opened his door. "Abraham," she said, "I walked 4 miles on a hot August day to ask a stranger for work, and he offered me a home instead. I am considerably more than glad." He held out his hand across the space between their chairs. She took it, as she had taken it that first time in the south meadow, and he held it with the same careful and enormous gentleness, and outside the sitting-room windows the Colorado evening was coming in its long, slow way, the sky going from gold to rose to the deep violet that preceded the stars, and the ranch was quiet and full and real, and Belle Garrison, née Ford, who had come west with a carpetbag and a letter and the complete refusal to be defeated by the size of what she did not have. Thought that precisely this, was the shape that arriving looked like. In the summer of 1889, Colorado achieved statehood, which Abraham noted by acquiring a proper American flag to replace the weathered one that had been flying over the ranch barn in various states of fray since before Belle arrived. She organized a dinner for the hands that was somewhat grander than usual and wrote to Eliza, who wrote back a letter full of democratic enthusiasm that made Abraham shake his head, with the fond exasperation of a man who has spent his entire adult life being politically outmaneuvered by his sister. Douglas started proper lessons in the little schoolroom that fall, and revealed that he had inherited Belle's facility with numbers and Abraham's obstinate persistence when engaged with something interesting, which made him an excellent student on his good days and an impressively immovable force on his less good ones. Clara, who was 2½ and had no official involvement in the lessons, had appointed herself an observer and sat in the corner during Douglas's lesson time, with a look of critical engagement that suggested she was forming serious assessments. Belle taught the lessons herself, which she loved in the way she had always loved teaching, with the particular pleasure of watching a mind encounter something new and decide what to make of it. Abraham occasionally appeared in the doorway of the schoolroom during lessons and watched with an expression that made Belle lose her train of thought, which she considered a small disciplinary failure and a perfectly acceptable price. By the autumn of 1889, 2 of the ranch hands had wives of their own, and 1 had a small son, and the bunkhouse had evolved into a compound of sorts, practical small dwellings clustered near the main barn, and the ranch had the character not simply of a cattle operation, but of a community, a small and self-contained world with its own social architecture, its conflicts and its loyalties and its celebrations. Thanksgiving that year was a table of 23 people, and a meal that required Belle to begin preparations 2 days in advance, and which produced a quality of communal happiness that sat in the room like a physical thing, warm and palpable, and visible in the particular way that shared joy is visible when a great many people who have genuinely chosen to be in the same place actually are. Abraham gave a toast, which was not his customary thing, and he kept it short in characteristic fashion, but what he said, standing at the head of that long table with his glass raised and his children on either side of him and his wife across the table looking at him with everything she felt in her eyes, was this: to the things that found us when we were not looking for them, and to the good sense to keep them when they arrived. Belle lifted her glass. Everyone lifted theirs. Douglas, who had been allowed a small glass of cider and treated it with the gravity of a sacrament, lifted his too. That evening, after the children were in bed and the hands had returned to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet and clean in the pleasant aftermath of a great deal of company, Belle and Abraham sat in the kitchen, at the table where they had first sat together, with the lamp burning between them. "Do you remember," Belle said, "when you told me to get off your land?" He winced slightly, in the good-natured way of a man comfortable enough with his past errors to wear them lightly. "I was attempting to protect myself from something I had not yet identified as worth having. You were very convincing," Belle said, "for about 30 seconds. And then you told me to come inside before I fell down in the heat." She smiled. "It was the least romantic invitation I have ever received. I accepted it immediately." He leaned forward across the table, resting on his forearms the way he did when he was being entirely honest and had no performance left in him. "Belle, do you know what I thought when I saw you standing on that porch?" "What?" "I thought, she is going to be trouble." Belle laughed genuinely, the kind that startled out of her before she could contain it. "Were you right?" "The best kind," Abraham said. "Completely and absolutely the best kind." He reached across the table and took her hand, as he had done 100 times since the first time, and the gesture had not lost any of its quality, had if anything accumulated more of it, the way certain things become more true with repetition rather than less. She looked at his hand around hers and thought about the distance she had traveled to arrive at this table. She thought about 4 miles in August heat and a crumpled letter, and a man in a doorway who had not yet understood what was about to change. "I asked only for work," she said softly. "I asked for nothing more." "I know," Abraham said. "I offered you a home instead." "Yes," Belle said, "you did." They sat together in the lamplight kitchen of the ranch house in the new state of Colorado, in the warm and settled quiet of two people who have done the difficult work of becoming a home to each other. And outside the windows, the enormous sky of the west was brilliant with stars, and the cattle were quiet in the winter pasture, and the children were sleeping, and everything that had been broken and incomplete in searching had found, in this place and in each other, the form it had been reaching for all along. Years would continue to come, as they do. Seasons of ease and seasons of hardship, the particular texture of a frontier life lived with clear eyes and committed hearts. Clara would grow into the observant, precise person her earliest months had promised, with Belle's love of language and Abraham's steadiness. Douglas would grow into something like a force of nature in human form, tall and determined, and full of his father's deep-running loyalty. There would be a third child, a son named James, who arrived in 1891 with the calm assurance of someone who knew he was expected and simply walked in and took up his place. The ranch would grow further, would evolve with the territory, would weather the hard winters and the dry summers and the changing economics of cattle at the end of a century that had made and broken 100 such operations. But the Garrison Ranch would not break. It would be held together by the same things that had always held it: the work, the land, the stubborn and absolute commitment to the people within its boundaries. And at the center of all of it, like the pin that holds a map in place, the woman who had come for work and been offered a home, who had accepted it and then made it more than either of them had imagined it could be. Belle Garrison, who had once been Belle Ford, who had walked 4 miles with a carpetbag and a letter and the complete refusal to be less than she was, and who had found, in an unlikely man in an unlikely doorway, the home that had been waiting for her on the other side of every mile she had traveled. The South Meadow bloomed every spring. The yellow flowers returned as they always did, reliable and extravagant and entirely themselves. And every spring, Belle and Abraham walked through them together, sometimes with children running ahead, sometimes alone, always with the easy silence of people who know each other well enough to share the quiet. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.